Team Trump 2.0 is taking shape. The US president-elect has nominated key members of his cabinet. Some of Donald Trump's picks are raising eyebrows. How will they shape Trump's foreign policy? And how will it affect the Middle East? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Donald Trump's foreign policy during his first term was guided by his campaign slogan, America First. What he delivered, critics say, was chaos. He burned through 2 secretaries of state, 2 defence secretaries and 4 national security advisers. He led the US out of the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. His administration also recognised Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Trump's second term will bring new challenges. The most pressing, wars. He said he'll end the fighting in Ukraine on day one, but hasn't explained how. His plans on Gaza and Lebanon are just as vague. And the people he's choosing to drive his agenda are controversial. Marco Rubio, the nominee for Secretary of State, is hawkish on China. Defence Secretary pick Pete Hegseth thinks Israel should annex the occupied West Bank. And National Security Advisor appointee Mike Waltz wants to cut aid to Ukraine. So how do Trump's choices signal his foreign policy to come? And will they bring peace to Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon? We'll raise these questions with our experts in just a bit. First, this report by Sarah Gill.
Together with Donald Trump, we are going to make America not just great, but greater than it has ever been before.
He was once a fierce critic of Donald Trump. Now, Marco Rubio is an ally and tapped to be the next US Secretary of State.
It's a tremendous honor to the President would place his confidence in me in a position of such importance.
Rubio is a foreign policy hardliner, known for favouring military might over diplomatic measures. His support for Israel is unwavering.
Here we are outside the office of Senator Marco Rubio.
Last year, he told peace activists that Hamas is to blame for the death of Palestinians in Gaza.
Are you filming it? So I want you guys to get this. I want them to destroy every element of Hamas they can get their hands on. These people are vicious animals who did horrifying crimes, and I hope you guys post that.
Palestinians say Trump's nominations are a major setback in achieving peace.
All these indicators suggest clearly that the US will continue to favour Israel, and that will only hinder the potential for a settlement and consequently prolong the conflict and suffering of the Palestinian people.
Then there's Pete Hegseth, Trump's surprise pick for Defence Secretary. He's an Army veteran and TV personality with no political experience, and many in the Republican Party and in the defence industry are alarmed.
He has excellent qualifications as a military officer, a junior officer. He's got excellent educational credentials, but he has no high-level national security experience and has never run a large organization.
If confirmed, Hegseth will have a daunting task: wars in the Middle East and Ukraine and the highly charged US-China rivalry. Hegseth is also an outspoken critic of NATO, but its Secretary General insists the alliance is integral to US security.
I've worked with Donald Trump for 4 years in my previous role as Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and I had a very good working relationship with him. He will do everything needed to defend the United States, and he is well aware that the membership of NATO is part of the defense of the US.
From Rubio's hardline policies to Hegseth's inexperience, President Trump's choices continue to spark debate. And with Gaza, Lebanon and Ukraine on the line, the stakes couldn't be higher. Sarah Gill, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. And in Washington, D.C., Niall Stanage, a White House columnist for The Hill newspaper. In Colchester, UK, Natasha Lindstet, Professor of Government at the University of Essex. And in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Mahjoob Zweiri, Professor of Middle East Politics at Qatar University. A very warm welcome to all of you. Niall, it's been quite the week there in Washington as Trump gathers speed with his appointments. What's the feeling there about his foreign policy picks?
Well, I think first off the top, Laura, we have to say it is President-elect Trump who's going to drive policy. He's the one who is going to make the decisions. That has always been the case in his political career. Now, having said all of that, the foreign policy choices generally reflect his worldview, of course. It is people who are loyal to him, who are part of that MAGA base for the most part. Rubio, you could argue, is a little bit of an exception to that, more of an establishment Republican kind of figure, even though he has cozied up to Trump more of late. But if you look at people like Pete Hegseth or Mike Huckabee, who has been nominated to be ambassador to Israel, or various others, there are people who are really very much on that America First wing that you alluded to in your introduction.
Absolutely. And Natasha, some of the reactions, if we look now at Europe, some of the reactions that I've been seeing from there are words like terrifying, unpredictable, big and bad, that the preferred picks are a bit less awful than the others. Is that the general tone that you're hearing?
I mean, there's definitely huge concern in Europe with just the election of Trump, but also with some of these picks that seem to be more based on loyalty than competence. I know that Europe has been preparing for this. Emmanuel Macron was actually stating very loudly, sounding the alarm, that Europe has to be prepared to be independent from the US. They can't rely on the US. They have to build up their own military and security measures. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on Europe, just in looking at the case of Ukraine, if Trump pressures Ukraine into some kind of surrender with Russia and then has to give up a lot of territory, it will be Europe that will probably be paying the bills of reconstruction. There's just a lot of concerns also about the pick of Tulsi Gabbard for intelligence, because she'll be heading 18 intelligence agencies, and the Democrats are concerned that she's some sort of Russian asset that uses Russian talking points, and there's concerns about whether or not there'll be breaches of intelligence. So on the European side, though, they were preparing for this. There's a lot of concerns about where things are going to go. And I'd like to just add that in the previous Trump administration, there are more traditional people surrounding Trump, people that believed more in democratic processes and were able to steer him better. This time, you don't have that. You have some really wild picks.
There's a lot that I want to pick up on from both of your answers there. But first of all, let's bring in Mahjoob Zweiri to get an idea of what the feeling is in the Middle East. Because Mahjoob, you're normally based here in Doha, so you're pretty tapped in to the feelings throughout the region here.
In the Middle East, there is an important saying that what will be the difference between Trump administration and Biden. Biden has approved or contributed to the current genocide in Gaza, killing more than 50,000 people, majority of them are kids and women, and injured more than 120,000 Palestinians, and basically the destruction of Gaza. So that all of this happened under the current administration, which basically contributed financially, politically to what happened in Gaza. So the new coming administration, they can do one thing, which basically imposing solutions. They cannot do more than killing. What has been done already, I think they reached to the point that that's maybe enough. So the perception is very clear that there is no huge difference between Biden administration or Trump administration. Maybe the good point about Trump, he's very clear. People, they can read what he does and his administration, and they can, to some extent, I'm not saying predicting, but they can realize that he will create more destruction to what's happening and more doubts. And I think more of the ideas focusing on one element, which basically people should not be optimistic about everything that Trump or his team will do, because small politics, the small differences, they may change the whole dynamic about what's happening in the Middle East. So that is important to watch, especially when it comes to imposing solutions. And here we remember the Abraham Accord. I think his administration wants to follow up on that, and trying to impose solutions, including West Bank, and supporting the Netanyahu's plan to have full or complete sovereignty on West Bank.
Niall, let's pick up on that, the impact that these picks might have on the Middle East region, because they are very, very, not just pro-Israel, but apparently pro-far-right Israeli policies. You know, the annexation of the occupied West Bank, putting settlements back into Gaza. Where do you think the region's headed?
In a pretty disastrous direction, in my view. I mean, you have, for example, you mentioned the occupied West Bank. Mike Huckabee, who I mentioned in my earlier answer, who has been nominated to be Trump's ambassador to Israel, does not use that phrase. And I'm not only referring to the word occupied, he refers to that territory as Judea and Samaria and appears to believe that it was divinely granted to the state of Israel. Now, I don't really want to get into the position of defending the Biden administration, because I think those policies speak for themselves and the death toll speaks for itself. But the Biden administration, in theory at least, believes in a two-state solution, and in theory believes that the basis of a Palestinian state would be obviously in the West Bank and in Gaza. Now, it's not at all clear that the Trump administration believes that. One thing, if I may, Laura, just very briefly to add on what was said earlier. The statement was made that people are at least clear about what Trump believes. I'm not sure that's true, because if you look at the city of Dearborn in Michigan, one of the few majority Arab cities in the United States, Mr. Trump got a plurality of votes there. And I don't think those people were voting on the basis of, let's call the West Bank Judea and Samaria.
They were, I believe, made promises during Trump's campaign that he has already broken. Now, just briefly, can you just expand on that for our audience?
Yes, absolutely. So basically, during the campaign, Michigan is a key state in American elections. It has the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the nation. Kamala Harris lost it. Donald Trump won it. In the run-up to Election Day, Trump was saying things like, well, Arabs are only interested in peace. That's the only thing they're appealing to. He was at least implying that there was legitimacy to the criticism of Biden's policies there. Now, I certainly believe there's legitimacy to that criticism, but there's no evidence whatsoever that Trump has any intention of moving in the direction that he appeared to be implying.
OK. Natasha, one thing that we can be sure of, at this stage at least, is that Trump wants to end the wars in the world, the Ukraine war being one of them. And we've got President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine also saying that he wants this war to end next year in a diplomatic manner. Does he believe that Trump will be able to deliver that and that the ending will work in Ukraine's favour?
So Zelensky believes he has no choice. He's been put in a corner here because he knows that he's not going to be receiving the type of aid that was coming, the type of military aid that was coming during the Biden administration. And they know that they're about to face a really harsh winter. They know that they're struggling to maintain their levels of recruits. They know that their infrastructure, much of their infrastructure has been destroyed, and that they're not going to be able to continue to wage this war without U.S. support, which is the largest donor. And so I think Zelensky is hopeful that he can get some kind of deal that doesn't force the Ukrainians to cede so much territory and to remain really insecure indefinitely. So he's trying to at least signal to the U.S. that he's hopeful that Trump will be able to create some sort of deal. But I think he's been pushed into a corner on this. I don't think this is what the Ukrainians wanted at all, but they feel that they have no choice.
To what extent can Europe, Natasha, move to fill the gap that's going to be left by the US should it stop its aid to Ukraine?
I think it's going to be very difficult because there's already fatigue with providing the level of aid that Ukrainians require. And probably the most difficult stages of the conflict for Russia, they've been able to weather. And they seem willing to just keep losing men in large numbers and to just keep this war going on indefinitely. I don't know if the resolve is there from the Europeans. I think they are individually trying to increase their own security. You know that in the Baltic countries where they actually fear Russian aggression, in countries like Estonia and Latvia, they're trying to double their number of military troops. And there are many countries within NATO that are trying to get towards, spending 2% of their GDP on their military spending, knowing that they will have to be alone, that they aren't going to be able to rely on the U.S. Now, with the pick of Marco Rubio, that means that he was one of the people that wrote the legislation that said that the U.S. Can't leave NATO. That does mean that there is some commitment to NATO, but the Europeans know that they will have to shoulder a lot of the burden moving forward.
Absolutely. Mahjoob, one area that we do know that the US will continue sending aid to is Israel. This Trump team has been highly critical of Biden's threat to withdraw military aid if Israel doesn't keep up humanitarian aid deliveries and improve the situation in Gaza. There's going to be no such threats coming from the Trump administration, are there?
I think it's expected that Israel will receive more support from Trump administration, more than not only when it comes to the political support, but also to the idea that the strong belief of what Netanyahu has in mind. That is, to me, as someone following the region, important than the military, important than politics, because the more they get close to the ideological aspect that Netanyahu believes in, that is the great support that Netanyahu wants. And I think that is what he wants to do in 2025. That's when he talks about the basically sovereignty on occupied Western Bank. I think what's important also to monitor is how much the team of Trump can have, I would say, a great agreement on how things should be done on the ground, because they are having many voices coming from the region, and there is a lot of impact coming from different countries in the region to try to de-radicalize Trump's policy towards the Middle East. And this will have also impact. And I think we saw the meeting of Elon Musk with the Iranian representative in the United Nations. That's an indicator about what I call it is the crisis from within. I mean, this is expected from someone who's more elected, appointed, who's more in politics in America. That's not expected of someone who's not elected. And if you allow me just in one sentence to say that Trump in the areas where Muslim and Arabs were a majority, he was voted for based on a social agenda. Palestine and Gaza is number 2. So I don't think so. I mean, I visited a lot of the places where Muslim and Arabs are there, and the major issue, number 1 to them, is social agenda. They are worried of the radical far left agenda, liberal agenda that Democrats has forced in the last 4 years, and those have families and they are worried. The only point they see it positive from Trump is the social agenda. And in the last 48 hours, there was a lot of critique on his actually pick for his administration. So I think American Arabs and Muslim in America, to them, number 1 is social agenda, and number 2 is actually other matters in the region.
Niall, is this administration going to be experienced enough to deal with the very complex nature, as Mahjoob just laid out for us, in the Middle East, all of the conflicting relationships that are going on? Are they fully plugged into all of that?
So I have maybe a slightly unorthodox view on that question, Laura. There is a tendency, I think, in America and in the Washington establishment to talk about experience above all else. If we look at the historical record, is it true that experience leads to wise or prudent decisions in the Middle East or anywhere else? I mean, it was an argument that was made back in the day, for example, by Hillary Clinton against Barack Obama. But her view, which had included support for the war in Iraq, was one of the main reasons why she lost the Democratic primary that year. People like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld are extremely experienced in foreign policy. Did that lead them to make good or solid decisions? So it is true that someone like Pete Hegseth, for example, has very little managerial experience. He has, to be fair, a master's degree from Harvard. But I guess what I'm pushing back on is the idea that experience in and of itself leads to good decisions. I don't think there's really very much evidence for that at all in recent American history.
OK, well, I can certainly see Mahjoob agreeing with you wholeheartedly there. Natasha, do you agree?
That's true. To some extent, you could have, the neocons, that they had all kinds of experience and they were making all kinds of bad decisions when it came to Iraq in particular, and the way the conflict in Afghanistan was handled. But I think with the role of Department of Defense, you do need some experience. You need some experience managing. If you've got 2.7 million employees, if you're running an enterprise that's worth $800 billion, and in the case of Pete Hegseth, his experience is running a small platoon. He has some combat experience, but that certainly isn't anywhere near enough that would be needed to run the Department of Defense. And I think that's a really poor pick. It's sent real concerns throughout from U.S. policymakers. Of course, they're going to be loyal to Trump, but I think this really shocked them, and there'll be a couple of senators that are really going to have a tough time with supporting Pete Hegseth to be the new Department of Defense Secretary.
Niall, Trump sees his unpredictability as a diplomatic strength. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that, do I agree that Trump is unpredictable? Certainly.
Yes.
I think he has provided abundant evidence of that over many, many years. And, one only needs to look at his dealings with North Korea to have a very clear example of that. One minute he was about to wreak enormous destruction on Little Rocket Man, as he derisively referred to the North Korean leader. And then by the end of his term, he was talking about them writing little love letters to each other. So there is certainly unpredictability. I guess the argument implicit in your question is, does that unpredictability unfoot rivals or adversaries? Is there a question that we'd better get ourselves in line because there's no telling what Trump might do? That's what his supporters would say. I also think, though, the flip side of that is there is a lot of uncertainty and insecurity and sometimes a lack of clarity, particularly as it relates to Europe, which Natasha referred to, not only to the situation in Ukraine, but the situation in broad swathes of Eastern Europe and where exactly the United States stands vis-a-vis, traditional allies or other Eastern European nations that are not traditional allies, but feel endangered by potential Russian expansionism.
Mahjoob, but it seems that the leaders, the countries that are going to benefit most from the Trump administrations are the ones that have a measure of him. And I'd say Netanyahu is one of those people. If the Washington Post report is to be believed, Netanyahu is planning to gift a Lebanese ceasefire proposal to Trump on his entry into the White House to give him an initial foreign policy boost. Do you think that's going to work?
I think Netanyahu is in a serious crisis in Lebanon. He's failing. He was trying to redefine the victory by bringing back the settlers to their cities in the northern Israel. He has failed to do so. He has done a lot of destruction in Lebanon, and nothing has been achieved. Hezbollah still is attacking most of the cities in Israel. I think what is significant is what he's trying to do. Is, of course, I agree with that. I did predict 2 weeks ago in a session here that there will be a sort of a gesture from Netanyahu to Trump so he can give him the carrot, actually. But I think this will not be helpful in two aspects. Number one, there is a serious issues that Israel is facing internally related to domestic politics. And secondly, I think there should be we expect to see more challenge to the administration, especially with the sideline of bureaucracy. And that's the point that I want to bring in discussion, because we talk about the administration, but we forget that the new administration wanted to sideline all of the bureaucracy, what's so-called the historical bureaucracy in the United States, or what's so-called deep state. Deep state now is suffering, and he's trying to actually get rid of all of this by what he's doing now with Elon Musk. And the more he's doing this, the more the decision-making process in Washington will go to a new concept, I believe, smaller group decision makers, which basically similar to autocratic regimes. So basically, there will be no reliance on those who are experienced, the memory of the country, whether in defense and foreign policy and security, those that will be gradually sidelined. And this will be, all decisions will be made based on short reports, short, I would say, recommendation done last maybe week or 2 weeks, and then major decision can be made. And that is very dangerous to the reputation of the United States, to the institutionalization in the United States, and also to the values that the United States was always talking about, the statehood and the decision-making process in Washington. That's beyond the regional issue. It has to deal with domestic politics of the United States.
Which, of course, has a huge impact on the rest of the world. Natasha, as we see the US perhaps retreating from global alliances like NATO, like the Paris Climate Accord, it becomes less of a world leader, perhaps less relevant. Will we see new alliances forming in its place?
I don't know. It's hard to say, but we know that the U.S. retreating from multilateralism has a huge impact. It reverberates all around the world. First of all, it just affects the level of democracy. When the U.S. is at its most democratic, that actually has knock-on effects in the level of democracy around the globe. We see very different trading relationships that have happened. We have more democracies trading more with autocracies than they're trading with other democracies. And we just don't have a leader with the U.S. sort of stepping away from this and going forward with this America First agenda. And I think one of the issues with Trump, he's so focused actually on this internal enemy that has already been stated, that I don't know how much he even cares or knows about foreign policy. He says he can make these deals quickly. He likes to be unpredictable. We don't have any evidence that madman theory actually works. And he's going to be very focused on the enemy within, gutting the deep state, getting rid of 50,000 civil servants, trying to find his enemies, weaponizing the justice system against his political opponents. But I think there's going to be a lot of chaos to come.
Now, Niall, just in the last minute that we have, we're talking about this particular team now. How long do you think it's going to last?
I mean, if the historical record is any guide, not very long. Mr. Trump, the first time around, had a very tumultuous administration. Lots of people kicked out or falling into disfavour. One thing I'll make just in the final few seconds we have is the points that you and Natasha and Mahjoob have been making about multilateralism. Those, of course, intersect with the specifics that we have been talking about. So, for example, Elise Stefanik, nominated to be ambassador to the United Nations, doesn't only share Trump's skepticism of multilateralism, has described the UN as a cesspool of anti-Semitism. Obviously, that has a very direct impact on the situation in Gaza, on funding for UNRWA and things of that nature.
It's going to be a very interesting 4 years at the very least. Many thanks to all our guests for joining us here today. Niall, Stanage, Natasha, Lindstet and Mahjoob, Zweiri. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.